everyone! So my name is Darla Long and this is my short description of what my final paper was about. My main strategy in my final paper was to place a financial cap on the amount of money that schools and districts and even states should spend per student, and any schools and districts that exceed this cap should take this money and funnel it into or distribute it to schools that do not reach this cap. So a quick explanation of how public schools are funded. They're funded from property taxes. So areas that are highly affluent have more valuable properties, and thus the dollar amount from said property will be higher than the dollar amount from not as affluent areas or areas in high need. And so public schools are funded within the district or within the county, so within an area, and that money goes into those schools, and they don't tend to bleed out into the other ones. So I did some other research, and I was looking at by state which states spend the most money per student. So in states like New York and Connecticut, they spent on average like $21,000 per year per student. But states like Montana only spend around $7,000. And for Washington State, it was a little bit above $11,000. And then when you compare it to studies and surveys that look at college preparedness for students per state, you find that states like Connecticut and Virginia and New York and New Jersey and Maryland, who are spending these greater amount of money per students, are having students who are more prepared for college. And these are just based on SAT and ACT scores. But it shows that there's a connection between the dollar amount spent per student and their supposed success later in life. So the three philosophers that I used were Freire's, and I used his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and then I used Emily Kawano's Solidarity Economy, and then I used Andrea Smith's Three Pillars of White Supremacy. So I used these three to help describe how underfunding in schools and how we should address it is necessary for feminist philosophy and liberation for oppressed groups, because schools that are underfunded face a lot of pressure. Pressure to keep up with schools that are properly funded in their test scores and their student success and their students' graduation rates. And that's honestly unfair, because somebody who has less resources available is not going to be as successful as somebody who has an excess of resources. So I am arguing that schools and districts need to come together and understand where the peak amount of money spent per student is that has a consistent success rate. So in a lot of different things, there tends to be a peak where I'm arguing that there is a peak dollar amount that a student will be just as successful as even if, like, across the board. So I'm saying that a student who has maybe $15,000 spent on them will be just as successful as somebody who has maybe $21,000 spent on them. Or any difference is going to be so marginal that it really shows that anything above this cap will be in excess. So And I don't think an excess in resources seems fair. Excesses in stuff maybe like a smartboard in every classroom just doesn't seem fair to me when you have schools where the teachers are not being paid enough, so they have to get a second job, or you have classrooms that are overflowing, and no classroom I think should have 32 plus students in it. I would have conversations with my friends from school, and they would have maybe 20 kids in their classrooms. But when I went to a supposedly pretty nice high school in the Des Moines area, I would have maybe 35 kids in my honors level classroom. So it's showing that, and then I can't even imagine what classrooms would have looked like in maybe some of the standard level classrooms. It would be insane. So yeah, so I used Free A to explain how schools that are underfunded have to rely on the banking mode of education to kind of keep their students in place and in line and in check, because the teachers themselves are honestly slaves to a grander system that keep the rich rich and keep the poor poor. So when they're feeling those pressures to keep up with the better and more affluent schools, you don't have leeway and wiggle room for students to be creative in their thinking, because they're restricted in their resources in what they have to give their kids, and I don't think that's okay. So, secondly, I described how the banking mode of education honestly instills a slave mindset, not only into the students, but into the teachers as well. And a slave mindset, as described, not a slave mindset, but the logic of slavery as described by Andrea Smith, is that black bodies are inherently slaveable and they're like a commodity. And when you use the banking mode of education, you learn that to be good is to be complacent. And if you're bad, you either punished into complacency or you're pushed out of the system into further marginalized areas of society, and you end up in very poor or dangerous jobs, or you end up in jail pretty much. And so when you have the slavery mindset, you become a slave, and that upholds capitalism. And as we know, capitalism and the slavery pillar help uphold white supremacy, which is another way that oppression manifests itself. And when you also have that slave mindset, you might think to act in ways that perpetuate the other pillars in hopes to escape your pillar. But as we know, all of the pillars will stay intact as long as individuals are trying to use the other to help escape their own. And so lastly, I used Emily Kawano to help describe why this strategy is a feminist philosophy. She has 5 principles to creating a solidarity economy. And a solidarity economy is one that offers a path toward an economy that serves people and planet, and it does not build the growth of private profits. And it's a global movement in general. So yeah. So the first of these principles was solidarity, which relies on cooperation and mutualism. So first of all, the schools and districts would have to come together. They would have to cooperate to find this cap. The second and third are equity in all dimensions and participatory democracy. And so all schools would have a voice, and that's the participatory democracy and equity in all dimensions. You are trying to have those in excess uplift and promote the growth and thus equality of those areas in need. Lastly, you have pluralism. in no way am I saying that the schools must become like each other to be successful. I'm just saying that the schools need to come together to find this cap that they deem appropriate, but once the money is allocated to the schools and the districts that are in need, they can look internally to help decide which areas need to be better funded. So each school has their own way of becoming a better school to serve its community, and it's reflective of the community how they spend that money. And lastly, this is a sustainable approach because, one, it is using the way that we gather taxes already. I'm not saying that we need to change how we determine how much of the dollar amount from property tax is spent towards schools. I'm just saying that we need to reallocate any excess funds past this cap determined in the other principles to a greater sense of community. And one counter argument that many people would say is a problem in this is that you are then taking away certain programs from those schools that are more affluent. But I don't think that would happen because in determining the cap, we still have to understand that there is this peak. And once we reach this peak, we understand that these students are not more likely to be successful than anything spent beyond that. So I don't quite see that as a viable counter-argument. I think that kind of argument exposes the individualism that is that a lot of people think is inherent in society and inherent in people, but I disagree. I think people lean towards cooperation way more often than that. And that kind of counter-argument also might expose certain stereotypes and isms that people hold, and I think when people are forced to face those, they should be more willing to lean towards creating a certain society that is beneficial to all. So thank you so much for listening to my supposedly quick recap of my final paper. I hope you find it interesting. I think having a fair education is the first step in creating and pushing for students who are more open towards equality, and more willing to expose certain power dynamics that perpetuate cycles of poverty. Thanks so much. I had a super fun class. I hope everyone else had as much fun in this class as I did.